The start position and initial movement of the bar from the ground can be as much as 50% of the entire technique of the lift. It's extremely critical that we employ the right start technique and that we're actually moving the bar correctly in the initial lift. Everything down the chain ends up either right or wrong based on what we did in the start position. Think of it as using the right technique will make you lift well most of the time, but using the wrong technique will make you lift poorly all of the time. The main difference we're talking about in the start position is between a static and a dynamic start. The only difference here is that in a static position, the lifter remains essentially motionless the moments before they actually break the bar from the ground. So there's no up or down movement of the hips or pelvis, no kind of jostling around those moments before they break the bar from the ground. A dynamic start is essentially when the lifter has a significant and pronounced dynamic action of the hips, either moving from the top down to the start position or from the bottom up to the start position, and then essentially immediately pulling. There may be a slight pause or a slight hesitation before they actually break the bar from the ground. It would still be considered dynamic just because they started their hips in a very different position and then moved them into position quickly, then pulled. Whereas a static position is going to be somebody basically looking motionless and then immediately starting the motion of the bar. So a good example of this, like in the top international levels here, would be to look at a lifter like Liu Xiaojun. He starts with a completely still body, then just initially breaks the bar and starts moving from there. There's no preloading or dropping of the hips or rising of the hips. He just gets set and he starts pulling. A good example of a lifter who has a really pronounced dynamic start would be Maddie Rogers. In the snatch, she starts, she lifts her hips up high, stretches the hamstring and everything, and then drops down and starts pulling against the bar immediately. The benefits of a static position would be that there's less chance of error. There's less chance to drop your hips and push the bar forward with your shin. There's less chance to drop your hips and fall forward onto your toes with the bar. There's less chance that you lift your hips up really high or don't lift them up high enough and end up on your heels. So you're not going to lose balance. You're eliminating the possibility of having an error in your start position because you moved too quickly or possibly too slowly into that position and just didn't do it correctly. The second pros of a static start position is that you won't tug the bar as much. You're not going to drop quickly, then lose tension against the bar and yank against it. You're starting completely static, so nothing is moving. Everything is tense where it needs to be, and then you start pushing from there. The cons of a static start position would be that you kind of eliminate that pre-stretching of the muscle. You don't have a chance to really stretch the hamstring out and then drop down and capitalize on that pre-stretching of the hip extensor. So that is eliminated with a static start position. The major benefit of a static start position, and really where it applies to a lot of people, outside of it just being a preference for some and not a preference for others, is that for beginners, it's excellent to use a static start position to solidify the technique of where they belong in the start. Beginners shouldn't be concerned with generating as much power as possible from the floor because they're not really trying to lift as much weight. They need to establish technique first. So it's a great tool to give beginners a chance to really solidify that position. In addition to that, it's also a good tool in your toolbox for variation. If you have a dynamic start, then use some lifts that are completely static in the start position. If you normally drop your hips down in the clean to pull, then try doing some static starts as a way to add variation to the lift without really adding a lot more volume. And then in addition to that, I think that static start positions are probably more common amongst very powerful, very strong lifters, more so than against like reactive and more explosive, kind of snappier lifters. You generally see the Chinese lifters starting with a static position. They generally are very, very strong, very powerful. And then oftentimes you see lifters that don't utilize their legs super well, or maybe don't have super strong legs, doing more of a dynamic start where they're trying to capitalize on that pre-stretching and just generate more force through a use of all the qualities of the muscle, not just sheer concentric force from the ground. The dynamic start pros and the benefit of a dynamic start, obviously we discussed this before, is the pre-stretching of the hip extensor prior to the pull. This is the biggest benefit here. When we set up, we can pre-stretch the hip extensor muscles, the hamstrings, then drop into position and use that elastic quality to generate a little bit better force off the ground. The more aggressive nature of the dynamic start too might facilitate a little more confidence for some lifters. When you set up and you are not the kind of person who likes to think about lifting or think too much, the dynamic start kind of gives you that chance to sort of drop in and sort of set everything up and get keyed up to pull. So it's a good way for people that really need that kind of psychological aspect to kind of get set and go. It's going to be a little bit better for them than a static position where, if you're sitting down the start position, it's easy to sort of start thinking about all the things that are going on. So think about that from a psychological perspective. But in addition to the pre-stretching, the cons of dynamic start positions are what we discussed before. You can easily push yourself out of position initially off the ground. If you drop too fast or you raise your hips up too quickly, you can fall forward, you can fall backwards, you can end up in a bad place. You can also end up tugging against the bar too much. If you set up in a dynamic position and you drop down quickly and start to yank, you might lose tension in the shoulders and arms as your hips are high. Then when you drop down, that is going to create like a situation where there's a lot of slack and you tug against the bar right at the beginning of the pull. In addition to this, one of the major things with a dynamic start is that it can become sort of a inconsistent tool where people are constantly fiddling with how they do it. It's easy to sort of have this sort of tactile feel to your start position. And when you have this dynamic start, it's something that people sort of create as a piece of the technique more so than just a small component of your start, where they might start to mess around with, I'm going to start with my hips like this, or start with my hips down there, or I just need to start from the bottom up, or start like this lifter, or start like that lifter. And it seems to be more common where people are quickly moving into position to do that. The other major con to a dynamic start is that if you have relatively weak positioning in the start of the pull or inconsistent positioning, you're not going to reinforce that with a dynamic start. If there's major errors, if your legs are weak and you don't push well off the ground and you keep dropping your butt down and trying to yank the bar off the ground, you're not helping yourself because you're not training that position. You're not training your legs to perform properly in the start position. So understand that both start positions work for a lot of people. Pick the one that makes the most sense for you, but understand that both are valuable tools. If you do a dynamic start or a static start, to try one or the other and use it as an object of variation. But in addition to that, for beginners, it's great to start by learning the technique first, learning the position first, and developing a great foundation and base, then moving into more of a dynamic start as they progress.